Hello. Today I will be working on something different. Basically I have this really junky trailer that I've had for a while. I used it for our move from Wisconsin and it worked. It did its job. However, yesterday I was using it to help somebody out and clear out their yard, and I had to drive it off a curb, after which I right away could tell that something wasn't right. So if that happens to you, please do not ignore it, because in my case it turned out to be a bad bearing. I noticed it as soon as I got under the trailer. You could tell that there was a little bit of separation right over here behind the wheel. So if you do have a bad bearing, you're gonna notice that there's a bit of a gap. That gap would be bigger right here, and you would most likely notice some grease. It would be pretty exposed. So make sure, if you're having a vibration issue or in general just checking your trailer, you'd want to look there. Another way to tell would be to just shake the wheel with the whole axle being up in the air. So in my case yesterday, I was in a situation where I did not have a lot of tools, and as it turns out, you don't really need a whole lot. For one, you definitely need a jack. Yesterday I had used a scissor jack and they worked perfectly fine. This is literally all you're actually going to need. This video is aimed for those who are stuck on the side of the highway, which I'm sorry is happening to you, but best case scenario, leave your trailer on the side of the road unless the auto parts store is very close, and head over there and buy these items. Gloves would be very helpful because you are going to get very dirty. At least one rag, ideally two. We're going to need a hammer and a flathead screwdriver. Grease to lube up the new bearing, and you're going to need degreaser to get rid of the old grease. And of course, the actual bearing that I got from AutoZone. In a second you'll find my axle does not have a hole for this pin, and it uses sort of a washer to keep the nut from loosening up. Hopefully you're never in a bind where you're on the road and you have to replace one of these, but that is definitely a possibility at all times. However, most spare parts stores will have it. Like in my case, I managed to get one of these at AutoZone. It was about 30 bucks. So first things you're gonna do is pop off this rubber cap that covers up all the grease. Secondly, you need to pop off the grease cover. It's called an Easy Lube cap, where you can just pop off this and then add grease to one of these guys quite easily. Next, there's going to be some sort of a pin holding this nut in place. It is right here. I just have to bend it down and it should be good to go. As surprising as that is, this nut over here, as you can see, is pretty loose. I guess they're not supposed to be torqued down a whole lot, so you might be able to just spin it off by hand. Sometimes you might have to give it a little bit of a encouragement. Screwdriver works pretty good for that. If you just set it on the side and then bang on it a couple of times with your hands. Alright, here we go. The nut comes right off. And then there's going to be a couple of washers. There's going to be one regular washer that you can just pry out with a flathead screwdriver. There's going to be this guy that has the little tabs that hold the nut in place. Pop it out with a screwdriver. So after these two, you have access to the actual bearing. As you can see, the wheel just slides off. If your bearing is in a bad shape, you are not really going to be able to slide this out as easily. In my case, this outer bearing ended up falling apart, and the little cylinders that you see right here, they ended up falling out, and some of them were stuck and made it a bit of a pain in the butt to slide off the wheel. On this side, this bearing hasn't failed completely, so we're not having that issue. Now on the back side of the wheel, you're going to have this dust cap that you can just pry out. You will be able to see a little line between the seal and the actual wheel hub, and that's where you're going to want to aim your flathead screwdriver. And if it doesn't really want to slide in on its own, you can give it some encouragement with a hammer. So now it is basically bent the seal to the point where the screwdriver is stuck in there, and you just pry it off. And that comes right out. In my case yesterday, my outer bearing completely fell apart. All I had left was this inner piece that goes right here. I didn't have a hammer with me last time. I had this giant axe that I ended up holding like this and just sliding it down the axle, which ended up bringing this out. So we're going to grab our degreaser, spray it on the rag, and wipe off the old grease. You want to make sure there's not much damage to the axle. Any major scoring will cause your new bearing to wear out very quickly. And then on the actual wheel, you'll want to clear out the grease as well. So technically bearings have two parts to them. In this case, this is our outer bearing that would go closest to the outside of the trailer. This is the bearing itself. This is the race, which is what the bearing races on spin inside of there. They do that because they don't want the bearing to grind on the actual wheel. It's much cheaper and easier to replace one of these than having to change the whole wheel because the bearing chewed up on it. So they install these inside of the center bore. So currently inside of here we have both races, the inner and outer, since in this case we have two bearings outside and inside. Theoretically, you don't really have to change the race if you're in a bind on the side of a highway somewhere and if it's being stubborn. That's actually what happened with me yesterday. I wasn't able to get these out and I decided not to because they were in an okay condition. It didn't seem like they were too worn out or scored or scratched up. This one here seems to be a little rusty, so I do want to change that. And the way you do that is pretty simple. Right now we're looking at the inside of the wheel, so this is the trailer side. And as you can see right there, you can see a bit of an edge inside of here, and that's where our race is. So we just want to set our flathead screwdriver on that and go around and slowly loosen it up. If you're in a bind and you're stuck on the side of a highway, don't worry about these if you don't see any damages. Like in this case over here, the inside one seems to be in perfectly fine shape. I don't see any reason to risk messing up the inside of the wheel by replacing this. Because when I do this, there's always a chance that the screwdriver is going to get caught on a part of a wheel and it's going to mess that up. We don't want that. There's no point in taking the risk. There we go. That's the sound we were looking for. As you can see, the reason I decided to get rid of it is because this inside seems to be a little yellow, which is an indication of rust starting to form. And rust is the last thing. Rust is the last thing we want in here. Spray the inside of the wheel with a degreaser. So on the inside here, you can see a decent amount of rust forming, and that's why that race and the grease was looking pretty rusty. That's gonna keep spreading into the wheel bearing around the hub. We just want to avoid that as much as possible. Rust does not belong in areas where we need as little friction as possible. I did my repair yesterday in an environment where I didn't have very good access to tools. However, now that's not the case, so I do want to get rid of that rust, and to do that I'm going to use one of these copper toothbrushes. No, not toothbrushes, just brush. So I'm just going to set the wheel down and go at it. Okay, I think this is good enough, and we can carry on with putting this back together. So this is where our grease is going to come in. Ideally, you would want to have a grease gun where you can just inject grease into the bearing. Unfortunately, somehow I still don't have one, so I'm just going to get myself even dirtier, but luckily I do have gloves. Now that all of these surfaces are nice and clean, and again, I have not replaced this race. If you really want to replace that, you can do that by the same methods, using a flathead screwdriver and banging it out from the outside. In my case, the race looks perfectly fine. There's no need to worry about it. So this guy's not going to be gang used. Here's our new inner bearing. Basically that sits right inside of this race. However, we do need to clean it up. I guess these gloves aren't doing me a whole lot of good, but it is. Maybe I'll use the other side. We basically want this filled up with grease. It's not going to hurt anything. Because if you do leave any room in there, that's where you're leaving room for air and water to get into and stay there. And that's what we do not want in there, because that will cause oxidation, aka rust. We're going to give a very generous layer of grease on the actual axle. Now that the inner bearing is in place, we can put on our seal. If you're not sure that you're putting down enough grease, that means you need to add more grease. Now this part you want to be careful with, because you might mess up the seal if you do this incorrectly. You might even be able to do it by hand, but that's not guaranteed. Ideally you want to find a block of wood, anything that's soft enough that's not going to damage this, but it's also big enough to cover this whole area. I'm looking around, I don't see anything except for one thing. That is my neighbor's trailer wheel stop log, whatever, chalk. So we're gonna borrow that very quickly before anybody notices. Give it some nice taps, go around. Up until it sits flush with the hub. Now that our spine mission is completed, I do recommend putting the race in at this time before putting the wheel on. It'll just make your life a lot easier. Hook up the race. If you do end up replacing the race, you'll notice that it slopes in one direction. And you want the direction to be outward so that you can put in the new bearing in. Otherwise, if you do it this way, the new bearing is not going to be able to slide in with the wheel on here. So the race goes in first. As you can imagine, taking out the old one was a bit of a pain in the butt, so putting in the new one is probably even harder. The key is to go around the circle so that this thing slides in evenly. Otherwise, if you bang in one side more than the other, it's going to angle in and gonna get itself wedged inside of the hub. So because we don't really want to hammer onto this race with a screwdriver, we don't want to mess it up, scratch it up, you can use your old race, set it on top, and use that to hammer it in. This will do a pretty good job of distributing the force, and it's going to keep the thing from getting bent or scratched up. You are going to need to keep banging it in until you see no gap between the race and the place where it's supposed to sit. Right there. You see those two edges? Basically, we want that gap to be completely gone. So if you are using your old race, you really want to be careful. You don't want to get it fully seized in there because then you're going to have a hell of a time getting it out. So don't hammer it in too far, which I might have already done. Because I'm an idiot, I wedged in the old race a little too far when I was trying to use it to push in the new one, and now I'm using these two big wrenches to try and pry it out. You want to rest them onto each other so that they're not putting in any force onto the race and just trying to pull it out instead of pressing it in. Otherwise, if you try to pry it out with a single wrench, it's not really going to work because one end is going to be getting shoved in while the other one is getting pulled out. I'm using a voiceover here because the wind noise was just really bad during this clip, and in general I apologize for the wind noise throughout this video. I didn't really think about that when I was taping this. My apologies. Another thing you can use that works a little better than a flathead is a big flat wrench, because it's got a bit more surface area to spread out the impact. And that looks to be flush with this where it's supposed to sit in, so we can finally slide this on. And now we are ready for our outer bearing finally, which is the last part that we're going to use out of the new kit. Once again, we're going to loop this up, even though obviously we have plenty of grease, but like I said, if in doubt, add more grease. The smaller radius end is going to slide in first. Use your head to straighten out the wheel and shove this guy in there up until it stops going in. We're going to clean off these parts that slide onto the end. Unfortunately, this kit does not come with the replacements. It would be ideal to change these two, but you really don't have to. This washer is going to go in first. And this guy. And then the nut. So it might feel like you're not putting this in far enough, and this nut is going to kind of take care of that. It's going to push in the bearing, push in the wheel a little bit further in. So this nut does occasionally get stuck on the little pins, even if they're not bent away. So you might have to, once again, give it a little bit of encouragement with the hammer. Nothing crazy, be nice to it. So keep in mind that this nut is not supposed to be tightened to keep it from loosening. This nut, as you remember, I took it off using almost only my hands. And you don't have to tighten it much, that's why I'm not even using a big wrench. You just need to tighten it to the point where the wheel is solid and has no side-to-side movement. As you can see now, this feels totally solid, and as you noticed, I didn't have to hammer very hard or anything to get it there. All we had to do is just tighten it down to the point where The bearing is setting all the way inside the race on both sides, and that's it. So at this point, we can bend up this little pin that's going to keep the nut from loosening up, and this is the part that actually keeps it safe, and we can pop on over the caps. Slide it on, pop in the lid, and you're done. Best case scenario, you would want to grease this up with a grease gun, like I mentioned. Once again, do not try to drive with a bad wheel bearing, because that is going to cause big issues. Your wheel will fall off eventually, and you might damage it to the point where a simple bearing replacement is not going to do it. You have to spend money. But as you can see, this spins perfectly fine now. We have no play, and job's well done. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this video helpful, and clearly if you watched this point you enjoyed it, so please like, subscribe, leave a comment if you have a suggestion or a comment. Thanks, have a good day.